When flight attendant Sarah Mitchell saw the well-dressed black man settling into seat 2A in first class, she was already reaching for her clipboard. What she didn't expect was to find herself standing at attention in the airplane aisle 15 minutes later, saluting a man she'd just humiliated in front of 200 passengers. The words that would shatter her assumptions hadn't been spoken yet, but they were coming. Colonel James Patterson, United States Army Rangers, returning from active duty. The cabin lights of Delta Flight 847 cast a warm glow over the leather seats as the Boeing 777 prepared for its red-eye departure from Los Angeles International Airport to Chicago O'Hare. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday night, and the first-class cabin held only 6 passengers, the kind of light load that usually made Sarah's job easier. Tonight, it would make everything more complicated. Sarah Mitchell had been flying for Delta Airlines for 8 years, and she developed what she called an eye for irregularities. The eye that had earned her 3 commendations for exceptional service, 2 department awards for customer satisfaction, and 1 formal complaint about discriminatory behavior that her supervisor had quietly buried in her personnel file. Tonight, that I was telling her something was wrong with the passenger in 2A. The man had boarded with the first-class passengers, moving with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to premium service. His navy blue polo shirt was pressed, his khaki pants creased, and his leather carry-on bag looked expensive enough to cost more than Sarah's monthly car payment. Nothing about his appearance screamed economy class, but something about his presence bothered her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. What Sarah didn't know was that the man settling into seat 2 had spent the last 18 months in Afghanistan, leading special operations missions in some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. Colonel James Patterson was finally coming home after his 4th combat deployment, and the first-class ticket he'd purchased with his own money was meant to be a small celebration, a comfortable journey back to the family he'd missed every single day for the past year and a half. Sarah approached the passenger in 3C, a distinguished businessman in his 60s wearing a Rolex that caught the cabin light. Robert Worthington was exactly the type of first-class passenger Sarah preferred. Wealthy, white, and unlikely to cause problems. His suit probably cost more than most people made in a month, and his carry-on briefcase bore the logo of a Fortune 500 company. "Good evening, Mr. Worthington," Sarah said with her brightest professional smile. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Worthington barely looked up from his tablet, but his eyes drifted toward the front of the cabin where Colonel Patterson was stowing his duffel bag in the overhead compartment. The bag was military-issue olive green canvas that looked out of place among the designer luggage typically found in first class. "That man up there," Worthington said quietly, nodding toward Patterson. "Are you sure he belongs in first class?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming the suspicion that had been gnawing at her since Patterson boarded. In 8 years of flying, she'd learned to read the subtle signals that separated legitimate first-class passengers from those who didn't belong. The expensive clothes could be knockoffs, the confident bearing could be an act, and the carry-on bag could be borrowed or stolen. "I'll double-check his documentation," Sarah whispered back, her voice carrying the conspiratorial tone of someone handling a delicate situation. Colonel Patterson had noticed the conversation, of course. 20 years of military service had taught him to be aware of his surroundings at all times, to read body language and subtle threats before they became obvious ones. He'd seen the flight attendant's initial reaction when he boarded, noticed the businessman's pointed stare, felt the familiar weight of assumption settling around him like a familiar but unwelcome coat. He'd been in this situation before, not on airplanes, but in restaurants, hotels, and country clubs where his presence was questioned despite having every right to be there. The difference was that in civilian life, he couldn't rely on military rank to establish his credibility. Here, he was just another black man in an expensive seat, subject to the same prejudices that had followed him since childhood. Patterson opened his book, a biography of General Colin Powell, and tried to focus on reading. He'd learned long ago that the best response to suspicious stares was dignified indifference. Let his conduct speak for itself. Remain professional. Don't give anyone an excuse to escalate the situation. But as he read about Powell's experiences as the first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Patterson couldn't help but reflect on how little had changed. Here he was, a decorated combat veteran and full colonel in the United States Army, and he was still being treated like an intruder in a space he'd rightfully purchased. Sarah moved through the cabin, checking on the other passengers while keeping one eye on Patterson. The elderly couple in seats 1A and 1B seemed harmless enough, retired school teachers from the look of them, probably using frequent flyer miles for an upgrade. The young man in 2C was clearly tech industry, all nervous energy and expensive gadgets, the type who bought first-class tickets like other people bought coffee. But the man in 2A remained an anomaly. He sat with perfect posture, reading intently, occasionally glancing out the window at the tarmac activity. His behavior was impeccable, no demands for service, no complaints about wait times, no entitled attitude that Sarah had come to expect from first-class passengers. If anything, he seemed almost too polite, too deferential. Which, in Sarah's experience, was exactly how guilty people behaved. Marcus Rodriguez, the junior flight attendant working his second year with Delta, approached Sarah near the galley. At 25, he was still learning the subtleties of customer service, still developing the instincts that separated good flight attendants from great ones. But he'd noticed the tension surrounding seat 2A, and it made him uncomfortable. "Everything okay up here?" Marcus asked quietly. Sarah glanced toward Patterson, then back at Marcus. "Just need to verify some documentation." "Probably nothing, but you know how it is." Marcus didn't know how it was, actually. In his 2 years of flying, he'd never questioned a passenger's right to their assigned seat unless there was obvious fraud involved. Duplicate boarding passes, clear intoxication, or disruptive behavior. The man in 2A exhibited none of those red flags. But Sarah was his senior, his mentor, and the person who would ultimately determine whether his probationary period ended successfully. If she said there was a problem, Marcus had to trust her judgment, even if his gut told him something different. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." Sarah made her decision. She couldn't let the plane take off with unresolved questions about passenger legitimacy. If there was fraud involved, discovering it after takeoff would create a much bigger problem than addressing it now. Better to be cautious than sorry. She walked purposefully toward the front of the cabin, her clipboard in hand and her professional smile firmly in place. Colonel Patterson looked up as she approached, his dark eyes meeting hers with the steady gaze of someone who had nothing to hide. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said, her voice carrying the polite authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm sorry to bother you, but could I see your boarding pass one more time? We're just doing a final verification of our passenger manifest." Patterson reached into his shirt pocket and handed over the boarding pass without comment. The document was clearly legitimate, first class, seat 2A, his name printed in bold letters across the top. But Sarah studied it as if looking for microscopic flaws, turning it over in her hands and examining the bar code with unnecessary intensity. "Is there a problem?" Patterson asked quietly. "No problem at all," Sarah replied, though her continued scrutiny suggested otherwise. "Just standard procedure." What Sarah was really doing was buying time, hoping to find some detail that would justify her suspicions. But the boarding pass was flawless, and Patterson's calm demeanor only added to her frustration. Criminals were supposed to look nervous when questioned. They were supposed to fidget, avoid eye contact, or offer too many explanations. Colonel Patterson did none of those things. He simply waited with the patience of someone who had spent months in hostile territory, where hasty movements could mean the difference between life and death. Finally, Sarah handed the boarding pass back. "Thank you, sir. I apologize for the inconvenience." But as she walked away, the seed of doubt remained. 8 years of experience told her that something wasn't right, even if she couldn't prove it yet. And with Robert Worthington watching her every move, expecting her to maintain the standards that kept first class exclusive, Sarah knew this wasn't over. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, but the Real journey was just beginning. If you've ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of how they look, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment about a time you saw someone stand up to prejudice. Because what happens next will completely change how you see assumptions, respect, and the price of judging someone by their appearance. The Boeing 777 reached cruising altitude 37 minutes after takeoff, and the cabin lights dimmed to their comfortable evening setting. Most first-class passengers had settled into their routines. Mr. Worthington was working on his laptop, the elderly couple was sharing a crossword puzzle, and the tech executive had his noise-canceling headphones on, lost in whatever was playing on his tablet. Colonel Patterson had been reading steadily since takeoff, occasionally making notes in the margins of his book. To any observer, he appeared completely absorbed in his reading, but his military training kept him peripherally aware of everything happening around him. He'd noticed Sarah's repeated glances in his direction, the way she lingered near his seat during her routine cabin checks, and the subtle but persistent scrutiny that felt all too familiar. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah made her decision. She approached Patterson's seat with the confident stride of someone who had convinced herself she was doing the right thing. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying a new edge of authority. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but we're having some issues with our seating system tonight. There might have been a computer error when your ticket was processed." Patterson looked up from his book, his finger marking his place on the page. "What kind of computer error?" "Sometimes the system accidentally upgrades passengers who should be in economy," Sarah explained, her tone suggesting this was a common occurrence rather than the fabrication it actually was. "I'm going to need to verify your original ticket purchase to make sure everything is legitimate." The word legitimate hung in the air between them like an accusation. Patterson had heard that tone before, in restaurants where hostesses claimed his reservations couldn't be found, in hotels where desk clerks questioned his credit cards, in countless situations where his right to occupy space was challenged based on assumptions about who belonged where. "My ticket is legitimate," Patterson said calmly. "I purchased it 3 days ago through Delta's website using my American Express card. I have the confirmation email, if you'd like to see it." Sarah's frustration mounted. His story was consistent, his documentation appeared authentic, and his behavior remained impeccably polite. But 8 years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her something was wrong. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "first class is actually overbooked tonight. We're going to need to move some passengers to premium economy to accommodate everyone." Mr. Worthington, who had been listening to every word of the conversation, looked around the clearly half-empty first-class cabin with obvious confusion. But he said nothing, content to watch the drama unfold from the safety of his unquestioned seat. Patterson followed Worthington's gaze, taking in the 5 empty seats that made Sarah's claim absurd. "The cabin appears to have plenty of available space. Those seats are reserved for crew rest on long flights," Sarah replied without missing a beat. "Company policy requires us to maintain certain seat availability ratios." It was complete nonsense, and Patterson knew it. But he also knew that arguing with airline personnel at 35,000 feet was a losing proposition. The flight attendant held all the power in this enclosed environment, and pushing too hard could result in consequences far beyond an uncomfortable seating arrangement. "I'd prefer to remain in the seat I paid for," Patterson said quietly. "If there's genuinely an issue with my ticket, I'm happy to resolve it when we land in Chicago." Sarah felt her professional authority being challenged, and something hardened in her expression. In her 8 years of flying, passengers who refused reasonable requests were usually hiding something. Legitimate first-class passengers didn't argue with crew instructions. They understood that cooperation was part of the premium service experience. "Sir, I'm not asking you to move. I'm telling you," Sarah said, her voice taking on the firm tone she used with unruly passengers. "Company policy requires me to ensure proper seating arrangements, and right now you're going to need to gather your belongings and move to seat 23A in premium economy." The conversation had attracted the attention of every passenger in first class. The elderly couple exchanged worried glances. The tech executive had paused his movie to listen, and Mr. Worthington was watching with the fascination of someone observing a social hierarchy being enforced. Colonel Patterson felt the weight of every eye in the cabin, felt the familiar burn of humiliation that came with being singled out and questioned in public. He'd experienced this same feeling in Afghanistan when local officials challenged his authority based on his appearance, not recognizing the rank insignia on his uniform or the respect his position commanded. But here, wearing civilian clothes on a commercial flight, he had no visible symbols of authority to fall back on. No rank insignia, no uniform, no immediate way to establish his credibility. He was just another passenger being asked to move, and the other travelers were making their own judgments about why. "Ma'am," Patterson said, his voice still controlled but carrying a slight edge, "I've been respectful, I've answered your questions, and I've shown you my valid boarding pass multiple times. I'm not going to move from a seat I rightfully purchased based on a policy that you're applying selectively." The word selectively hit Sarah like a slap. She knew exactly what he was implying, and the accusation stung because part of her recognized its truth. But acknowledging that truth would mean confronting assumptions she wasn't ready to examine. "Sir, if you don't comply with crew instructions, I'll be forced to contact the captain," Sarah warned. Interfering with flight crew duties is a federal offense. Patterson closed his book and looked directly into Sarah's eyes. "Then I suggest you contact the captain. I think he might be very interested in hearing about this conversation." The gauntlet had been thrown. Sarah realized she was now committed to a course of action that would require her to justify her decisions to higher authority. But backing down in front of a cabin full of passengers would undermine her credibility and authority. She reached for the intercom button, her hand trembling slightly with adrenaline and anger. The confrontation was about to escalate far beyond anything either of them had intended. Sarah's finger hovered over the intercom button for a moment that stretched like eternity. The entire first-class cabin had fallen silent except for the steady hum of jet engines and the whispered conversation of the elderly couple, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. "Captain Johnson to first class, please," Sarah announced through the intercom, her voice carrying across the cabin with the authority of someone who believed she was handling a legitimate security issue. "We have a passenger situation that requires your attention." Colonel Patterson remained perfectly still in his seat, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his expression giving away nothing of the storm building inside him. 20 years of military service had taught him that sometimes the best strategy was to let your opponent commit to a course of action that would ultimately expose their own weaknesses. Marcus Rodriguez approached from the galley, his young face creased with concern. "Sarah, are you sure about this? The passenger seems completely reasonable, and his documentation." "Marcus," Sarah cut him off sharply, "I've been doing this job since before you graduated high school. I know how to identify problems before they become emergencies." Captain David Johnson emerged from the cockpit 3 minutes later, his pilot's uniform impeccable and his bearing commanding the instant respect that came with 22 years of commercial aviation experience. At 54, Johnson had seen every type of passenger situation imaginable, from drunken celebrities to legitimate security threats, and he developed an uncanny ability to assess situations quickly and accurately. What made Captain Johnson different from many of his colleagues was his own military background. He'd served 8 years in the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation, and that experience had taught him to recognize authority in all its forms, not just the obvious symbols of rank and uniform, but the subtler indicators of discipline, bearing, and character. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Johnson asked, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. Sarah straightened, grateful to have backup arriving. "Captain, we have a passenger in seat 2A who's refusing to comply with crew instructions. His ticket appears to have been upgraded through a system error, and when I asked him to move to his proper seat in economy, he became argumentative and threatened to file complaints." Captain Johnson looked at Colonel Patterson, taking in the man's calm posture, his neat appearance, and the military bearing that was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to recognize it. Then he looked around the clearly half-empty first-class cabin, noting the abundance of available seats that made Sarah's story immediately suspect. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" Captain Johnson asked Patterson directly. Patterson handed over the document without comment. Johnson examined it carefully, noting the first-class designation, the proper seat assignment, and the legitimate Delta booking code. Everything about the boarding pass appeared completely authentic. "This appears to be a valid first-class ticket," Johnson said, handing it back to Patterson. "Mr. Patterson," the colonel replied. "James Patterson." Something in the way Patterson said his name caught Johnson's attention, not arrogant or demanding, but carrying a quiet confidence that suggested this was a man accustomed to being taken seriously. Johnson had heard that tone before, usually from passengers with military or government backgrounds. "Mr. Patterson, have you been disruptive or non-compliant with any crew instructions?" Johnson asked. "No, sir," Patterson replied. "I've been reading quietly in my assigned seat since takeoff. I've answered every question the flight attendant has asked, shown my documentation multiple times, and remained polite throughout this encounter." Sarah felt the situation slipping away from her. "Captain, the passenger is being deliberately obtuse. When I explained our seating policies, he refused to cooperate and started making accusations about selective enforcement." "What kind of accusations?" Johnson asked, his tone sharpening slightly. Patterson spoke before Sarah could respond. "I simply observed that the policies being applied to me don't seem to be applied equally to other passengers. The cabin is clearly not overbooked. There's no computer error with my ticket, and I haven't violated any airline regulations." Captain Johnson looked around the cabin again, taking in Mr. Worthington's obvious comfort in his seat, the elderly couple's undisturbed seating arrangement, and the tech executive who was pretending not to watch the proceedings while clearly recording everything on his phone. "Sarah," Johnson said quietly, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They moved toward the galley, but their conversation was clearly audible to the first-class passengers. Johnson's military training had taught him the importance of maintaining unit cohesion, but it had also taught him when subordinates were making mistakes that could have serious consequences. "What exactly is the problem with this passenger?" Johnson asked in a low voice that didn't hide his growing skepticism. "He doesn't belong in first class," Sarah insisted. "I can tell. 8 years of experience, Captain. I know when something's not right." "Based on what evidence?" Johnson pressed. "His ticket is valid. His behavior is exemplary, and your explanation about overbooking doesn't match the reality of what I'm seeing." Sarah felt cornered, forced to articulate suspicions that sounded increasingly unreasonable when spoken aloud. "It's just, he doesn't fit the profile of our typical first-class passengers." The words hung in the air between them, and Captain Johnson felt a cold recognition of what was really happening. He'd seen discrimination before, both in the military and in civilian aviation, and he'd learned to recognize it even when it was disguised as policy enforcement or security concerns. "Sarah," Johnson said, his voice carrying a warning, "are you telling me that you've been harassing a paying passenger based on your personal assessment of whether he fits the profile of first-class service?" Before Sarah could respond, Mr. Worthington's voice cut across the cabin from his seat. "Excuse me, Captain, but some of us paid good money for a peaceful flight. Can't you just move the man to economy where he belongs and be done with it?" Captain Johnson turned to face Worthington, his expression hardening. "Sir, every passenger on this aircraft belongs exactly where their valid ticket places them. And right now, Mr. Patterson's valid ticket places him in Seat 2A. The rebuke hit Worthington like a physical blow, and he sank back into his seat with a reddening face. Patterson watched the exchange with growing respect for the captain. It was clear that Johnson understood exactly what was happening and was choosing to stand on the side of what was right rather than what was convenient. But Colonel Patterson also knew that this situation was rapidly approaching a point where his patience would run out. He'd spent 2 decades defending principles of equality and justice, and watching those principles be violated at 35,000 feet was testing every ounce of his military discipline. The moment of truth was approaching, and everyone in first class could feel it. Sarah realized her authority was crumbling, her justifications falling apart under scrutiny, and her career potentially hanging in the balance. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position, making a choice that would force the situation to its inevitable conclusion. Captain, with all due respect, I stand by my assessment. This passenger needs to be moved. Captain Johnson looked at Patterson, then at Sarah, then at the cabin full of passengers watching this drama unfold. His military training told him to maintain chain of command, but his conscience told him that some orders shouldn't be followed. The confrontation was about to reach its breaking point. Captain Johnson stood in the aisle of first class, acutely aware that every passenger was watching him navigate a situation that had spiraled far beyond a simple seating dispute. His 22 years of aviation experience told him that Sarah's behavior was not only wrong, but potentially catastrophic for the airline. His 8 years of military service told him something else entirely, that the man sitting calmly in seat 2A possessed a type of discipline and bearing that came from years of command responsibility. Sarah, Captain Johnson said, his voice carrying the weight of final authority, I need you to return to your duties. Mr. Patterson will remain in his assigned seat for the duration of this flight. Sarah felt her world crashing down around her. 8 years of experience, 3 commendations, 2 awards. All of it was about to be destroyed by her inability to back down from a position she knew was becoming indefensible. But something deeper than professional pride was driving her now, something she couldn't quite name, but couldn't quite abandon. Captain, I cannot in good conscience allow this irregularity to continue, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. I have a responsibility to maintain standards in this cabin, and those standards exist for a reason. The word standards hit Colonel Patterson like a physical blow. He'd heard that word used as a weapon before, usually by people who wanted to exclude others without admitting their true motivations. Standards for dress codes that happened to discriminate against certain hairstyles. Standards for behavior that seemed to apply differently depending on skin color. Standards that weren't really about maintaining quality, but about maintaining barriers. Marcus Rodriguez watched the confrontation with growing horror. In his 2 years with Delta, he'd never seen a situation escalate this far over what appeared to be absolutely nothing. The passenger in question was quiet, polite, and properly documented. The captain was clearly on his side. Sarah was standing alone, defending a position that made no sense to anyone watching. Ma'am, Marcus said quietly, approaching Sarah, maybe we should just... Marcus, step back, Sarah snapped. This doesn't concern you. But it did concern him, and Marcus knew it. He was witnessing something that would either end quietly or explode into a situation that would affect everyone's career. His instincts told him to document everything, to protect himself from the fallout that was coming. Mr. Worthington, who had been silent since Captain Johnson's rebuke, suddenly spoke up again. Look, I don't care what anyone's title is. I paid for first class to avoid exactly this kind of situation. If you can't handle basic passenger management, maybe I need to speak to your supervisor. The threat was clear. A wealthy passenger threatening complaints that could cost jobs and damage careers. It was the kind of leverage that usually forced airline employees to capitulate to unreasonable demands. But Captain Johnson had reached his limit. Mr. Worthington, if you continue to disrupt this flight with inappropriate comments, I'll be happy to arrange for law enforcement to meet us in Chicago. Your ticket price doesn't entitle you to discriminate against other passengers. Patterson watched this exchange with a mixture of admiration and sadness. The captain was showing real courage, standing up to both employee insubordination and customer pressure to do what was right. But Patterson also knew that the situation was rapidly approaching a point where someone would have to make a choice that couldn't be undone. Sarah looked around the cabin, seeing her position crumbling, but unable to retreat. Captain, if you won't support your crew in maintaining proper standards, then I'll have to file a formal report with corporate about this passenger's disruptive behavior and your failure to address it. The threat was desperate and everyone knew it. Sarah was essentially threatening to lie in an official report rather than admit she'd been wrong. But her 8 years of experience had taught her that corporate often sided with employees over passengers, especially when discrimination could be disguised as policy enforcement. Colonel Patterson had heard enough. 20 years of military service had taught him when a situation required decisive action, when patience became enablement, when tolerance became complicity. He'd watched good people remain silent in the face of injustice, and he'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop wrong was to reveal truth. "Captain," Patterson said, his voice carrying a new authority that made everyone in the cabin look at him with sudden attention. "Before this goes any further, I think everyone needs to understand exactly who they're dealing with." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Something in Patterson's tone had changed fundamentally. The deferential passenger was gone, replaced by someone who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Sir," Captain Johnson said, sensing the shift in dynamic. Patterson reached slowly for his carry-on bag, telegraphing every movement to avoid any misunderstanding. His actions were deliberate and precise, carrying the kind of measured authority that came from years of high-stakes decision-making. "Ma'am," Patterson said, looking directly at Sarah, "you've questioned my right to be here, dismissed my documentation, and threatened my character. You've accused me of fraud, disruption, and noncompliance. You've done all of this based on your assessment of whether I fit the profile of someone who belongs in first class." Each word hit Sarah like a hammer blow, because each word was absolutely accurate. "But before you file any reports or make any more accusations," Patterson continued, "I think you should know that I've spent the last 18 months in Afghanistan, leading special operations missions in defense of the very freedoms you're currently trying to deny me." The cabin fell completely silent. Even the ambient noise of the aircraft seemed to fade as every passenger strained to hear what came next. Patterson unzipped his carry-on bag and withdrew something that made Captain Johnson's breath catch in his throat. A pristine Army dress uniform with Colonel's eagles gleaming on the shoulders. "My name is Colonel James Patterson, United States Army Rangers," he said, his voice carrying the command authority that had directed missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. "And I think it's time we had a conversation about respect, service, and exactly what first-class treatment should look like." The revelation hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Sarah's face drained of all color as the full magnitude of her mistake became clear. She hadn't just been harassing a passenger. She'd been humiliating a decorated combat veteran. Captain Johnson, recognizing the eagles of rank that outranked most officers he'd ever met, instinctively straightened to attention. The power dynamic in first class had just been completely reversed. The silence that followed Colonel Patterson's revelation was so complete that the only sounds in the first-class cabin were the steady hum of jet engines and the barely audible gasp from the elderly woman in seat 1B. The Army dress uniform lay across Patterson's seat like evidence in a courtroom, the silver eagles on the shoulders catching the cabin light and reflecting years of service, sacrifice, and authority that none of the passengers had imagined. Captain Johnson stared at the colonel's insignia with the recognition that came from 8 years of military service. He'd served under officers of various ranks, but full colonels were rare, especially in special operations. The man sitting in seat 2A wasn't just any military officer. He was part of an elite group that commanded respect from the highest levels of government and military leadership. Without conscious thought, Captain Johnson straightened to full attention and rendered a crisp military salute. "Colonel Patterson, sir," Johnson said, his voice carrying the automatic respect that 22 years of aviation and 8 years of Air Force service had ingrained in him. "I apologize for this treatment. It's completely unacceptable, and it does not reflect the values of this airline or the respect you've earned through your service." Colonel Patterson returned the salute with the practiced precision of someone who had rendered and received thousands of them over 2 decades of service. But his eyes never left Sarah's face, watching as the full magnitude of her actions settled over her like a physical weight. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the reality of the situation crashed down around her. She hadn't just been harassing a passenger. She'd been systematically humiliating a decorated combat veteran. A man who outranked most of the officers she'd ever heard of. Someone whose service record probably included classified missions she couldn't even imagine. "Sir, I didn't know," Sarah stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Colonel Patterson replied, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had commanded men in life and death situations. "You saw a black man in an expensive seat and made assumptions. You ignored valid documentation, dismissed legitimate explanations, and attempted to humiliate someone based on your personal prejudices rather than facts." Each word hit Sarah like a physical blow because each word was undeniably true. She'd let her biases override her training, her judgment, and her basic humanity. She'd become everything she'd been trained not to be, an employee who saw threats instead of customers, problems instead of people. Mr. Worthington, who had been watching the proceedings with growing horror, suddenly understood that he'd been complicit in the public humiliation of a war hero. The man he dismissed as someone who didn't belong in first class had spent months defending the very country that afforded Worthington the privilege of flying in luxury, while others served in combat zones. "Colonel, sir," Worthington said, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you an apology. My comments were inappropriate and disrespectful. I'm deeply sorry." Marcus Rodriguez stood frozen near the galley, his mind reeling from the transformation he'd just witnessed. The quiet, polite passenger had revealed himself to be someone whose military rank and service record commanded respect from everyone in the cabin. More importantly, Marcus realized he'd been watching discrimination unfold in real time and had done nothing to stop it. The tech executive in seat 2C slowly lowered his phone, suddenly aware that he'd been recording what was probably the most dramatic reversal of assumptions he'd ever witnessed. The video he'd captured as entertainment had become something much more significant. Documentation of how prejudice could blind people to the character and service of others. Colonel Patterson looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of people who had just learned a fundamental lesson about the danger of assumptions. The elderly couple sat in stunned silence. The businessman was visibly shaken, and the flight attendant who had tormented him for the past hour looked like she was about to collapse. "For 20 years, Patterson said, his voice carrying across the cabin with the authority of someone accustomed to addressing troops before dangerous missions, "I've served this country in places most Americans have never heard of. I've led special operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, commanded men in combat situations, and made decisions that saved American lives." His words carried the weight of absolute truth, backed by the uniform that lay before him like physical evidence of service and sacrifice. "I've been awarded medals for valor, commended for excellence under fire, and trusted with responsibilities that would break most people under their pressure," Patterson continued. "I've defended the Constitution that guarantees every American the right to be treated with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the full impact of her actions became clear. She hadn't just violated airline policy. She'd violated the principles that this man had risked his life to defend. "Colonel," Sarah whispered, "I don't know how to apologize for what I've done." Patterson studied her face, seeing genuine remorse there, but also recognizing the broader implications of what had occurred. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's prejudices. It was about systemic assumptions that affected countless people every day. "The question isn't how you apologize," Patterson said quietly. "The question is what you're going to do to ensure this never happens again. To anyone." Captain Johnson, still standing at attention, felt the weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had a decorated war hero in his cabin who had been subjected to discrimination by his crew, and the situation required immediate action. "Colonel, sir, what would you like me to do?" Johnson asked. Patterson looked at Sarah, then at the captain, then at the other passengers who were watching this moment of truth unfold. He was facing a choice that would define not just the rest of this flight, but potentially the rest of Sarah's career and the airline's policies. He could demand consequences, disciplinary action, termination, public accountability. He had every right to pursue justice through official channels, to ensure that discrimination had real costs. Or he could choose a different path, one that focused on education rather than punishment, transformation rather than destruction. The choice would reveal as much about his character as the uniform had revealed about his service. If this moment just gave you chills like it gave me, smash that subscribe button and tell me in the comments about a veteran in your life who deserves recognition. Because what happens next will show you the true meaning of leadership and how one choice can change everything. Colonel Patterson looked at Sarah Mitchell, really looked at her, and saw something he'd learned to recognize in young soldiers who had made serious mistakes under pressure. Not just fear of consequences, but genuine recognition of how wrong she'd been. It was the look of someone confronting the gap between their values and their actions. "Sarah," Patterson said quietly, using her name for the first time, "I could end your career with a phone call. I could file complaints that would make national news, turn you into an example of everything wrong with airline discrimination." Sarah nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I know, sir. I deserve whatever consequences you decide. But I'm not going to do that," Patterson continued, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen good people make terrible choices under pressure. "Do you know why?" Sarah shook her head, unable to speak. "Because I've seen soldiers, good soldiers, let fear and prejudice cloud their judgment in combat situations. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. It's what they do after they realize they've made them." Captain Johnson watched this exchange with growing respect for the colonel's leadership. This was what real authority looked like, not the power to destroy, but the wisdom to transform. "I want you to remember this moment," Patterson told Sarah. "I want you to remember what it felt like to realize you were wrong. And I want you to use that feeling to ensure this never happens to anyone else." Sarah straightened slightly, recognizing the tone of a superior officer giving a mission assignment. "Yes, sir. I promise." Patterson turned to address the entire cabin. "Everyone here has learned something tonight about the danger of assumptions. Mr. Worthington, you supported discrimination because it confirmed your biases. Marcus, you stayed silent when you knew something was wrong. Captain Johnson, you did the right thing when it mattered most." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But all of you will leave this plane with a choice. You can forget what happened here, or you can remember that respect isn't earned by wealth or skin color. It's earned by character, service, and how we treat others when we think no one important is watching." The plane began its descent into Chicago O'Hare. As passengers prepared for landing, something fundamental had changed in that first-class cabin. Sarah approached Patterson one final time. "Colonel, how can I make this right?" Patterson smiled, the first genuine smile he'd shown since boarding. "Become the flight attendant you were meant to be. Treat every passenger like they might be someone's hero coming home." 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell became Delta's head of diversity training, using her experience to teach thousands of employees about unconscious bias. Marcus Rodriguez requested to work exclusively with her program, becoming an advocate for inclusive service. Mr. Worthington quietly donated $50,000 to veterans organizations and never again questioned another passenger's right to their seat. Captain Johnson and Colonel Patterson maintained a friendship, with Johnson often saying that the colonel taught him the difference between authority and leadership in a single conversation. The tech executive's video never went viral, not because it wasn't dramatic, but because Patterson asked him to delete it. "Some lessons," the colonel said, "are more powerful when they happen in private." Colonel James Patterson's story proves that true strength isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to lift others up rather than tear them down. When faced with the choice between justice and mercy, between punishment and transformation, he chose the path that created change rather than just consequences. If this story changed how you think about assumptions, respect, and the hidden heroes around us, subscribe for more stories that reveal the extraordinary courage in ordinary moments. Comment below about someone in your life who chose mercy over revenge. And share this video because everyone deserves to see what real leadership looks like. Remember, beneath every uniform, military or civilian, there's a human being with a story worth knowing. Sometimes that story will surprise you, sometimes it will humble you, and sometimes, if you're brave enough to listen, it will transform you. Until next time, keep looking for the heroes hiding in plain sight, And remember that the way we treat others, when we think no one important is watching, reveals everything about who we really are. True first-class service isn't about expensive seats. It's about treating every person with the dignity they deserve, regardless of how they look or where we think they belong. Because you never know when the person you're judging might be the very hero who defended your right to judge them.